Presentation aids, otherwise known as handouts or visual aids. Why would you want to use one of these or some of these during your speech? You use your visual aids just to support your presentation. They can help you keep things simple. They help your listeners follow along. It can be hard for people to process information that they hear, so you want to use all the tools you can to make it easy for your listeners to pay attention and understand. Using visual aids can help with that because it shows the organization of your speech. It also helps them to focus, to understand, and to remember. Visual aids can also help you as a presenter. It helps you organize your thoughts or disguise your notes. A quick glance at your visual aid can remind you of where you are in your speech. You can also use the visual aids to show problems, solutions, and benefits, which can help convey your information. And they can also show processes, procedures, and sequential steps. So if you are giving a talk that involves any of these concepts, your visual aid can help you demonstrate those to the audience. In the short form, people remember 10% of what they hear. They'll remember 35% if they're shown a visual aid with no content. They'll remember 65% if you use a visual aid and discuss it. So, you've decided yes, it's important to use a visual aid in your speech. How do you figure out what kind to use? There's 3 basic criteria for deciding. Number 1, communication power. Will this aid help your audience understand what it is you're trying to communicate? Will it help you achieve your speech goal? 2, convenience. It has to be something that you have access to relatively easily, something that you can purchase, something that you can make, something that you can get your hands on. And number 3, cost. There may be an amazing visual aid which would do a great job, but it's going to cost you $1,000. Probably not worth it for a class. Maybe worth it if you're giving a pitch for a contract that could make you $50,000. So you're always trying to balance the power. If it's not effective, it's not worth it. The convenience, it has to be something that it's reasonable for you to get, and cost. It can't cost more than it's worth. You want something that is simple and accessible to both you, but more particularly to the audience. It needs to be easy to create and easy to use, and the benefits should outweigh the cost. There are different kinds of presentation aids that are available for you. You can use presentation software, you can display visuals, you can use physical objects, you can use audio and video clips, and you can use handouts. And here's a little humorous visual. I don't recommend you use this kind of presentation aid. Presentation software, these are PowerPoint, which is the most commonly used, Prezi, which is a great alternative and processes the information a little bit differently. Amaze is another one. There may be other presentation software that you know about, or you can use different kinds of software as a presentation aid. For example, I like to use Book Creator, which is software that's designed to help you make an online book, but can actually be hacked to create interesting presentation software. Displayed visuals. What do I mean by that? Flip charts, poster boards. You can use the blackboard or the whiteboard. You can use sketches. You can use charts. You can use graphs, diagrams, photographs, artwork, or computer-generated images. What I mean by this is not within a PowerPoint, but as a standalone visual aid. You can use physical objects, samples of something that you're discussing. If you are trying to show someone how to create origami, you might have the actual object you're trying to show them how to create. You can use a model if the object itself is either too large, like you're trying to show them something about the space shuttle, that's not going to fit in a room, or if it's too small, like if you're trying to show a molecule or DNA. Handouts. Usually this is a piece of paper. It's used to provide additional information for the listener, but it could also be a sample. The handout is something that the listener is going to take home with them. So you've decided you do want to use a visual aid. You've decided what it's going to be. Now you've got to create it. Some tips on designing your aids. Make sure the visuals are large, clear, and uncluttered. It needs to be a good design, large enough for your audience to see. If you're using physical objects, particularly things like pictures or charts, make them all the same size. Do this in your PowerPoint as well. If you're handling physical objects, if they're the same size, it makes them easier to handle, and that uniformity in both the PowerPoint and the visuals makes it appear that you're organized and professional. Hopefully you are, but if not, at least you'll look it. And make sure you have adequate color contrast. You don't want your audience straining to be able to see what it is that's on your visual aid. If you're using presentation software, some basic rules. Follow the 5-5-5 rule. No more than 5 words per text line, no more than 5 lines of text per slide, no more than 5 text-heavy slides in a row. You do not want people faced with a wall of text in your PowerPoint. The PowerPoint isn't presenting the information you are. The PowerPoint is an aid. Make sure you use the contrasting colors. Make it easy to read. So this means you want it to be, the font to be large enough that it's easy for your audience to see. You're going to have to consider the space. So if you're presenting in a larger space, the font needs to be even bigger. You want contrasting colors, but you want it to be attractive. So be careful about what color you're putting on what color, because sometimes it can actually make it harder to read because the contrasting color is jarring. So you want it contrasting, but you want it attractive, easy to read. Use simple, attractive fonts. Limit your animations. Don't go crazy with things flying in and out or having excess sound. You want to keep things fairly straightforward, and you add an animation if you think it's going to amplify a point you're making at a particular spot in your speech. If you have too many of them, it distracts rather than helps you achieve your speech goal. And whatever you decide, be consistent in your design. So once you decide the design you're going to use it the same way throughout the PowerPoint. If you're going to use bullet points, don't suddenly switch to arrows. If you're going to have a header in a particular font, don't change the header to a different font somewhere else in the PowerPoint. Make sure you stay consistent. Now, if you want to take it up a notch, make it even stronger, match the design to your content. This doesn't always work, but think about what it is you're trying to present and see if there's any way that you can add a layer of that to your design. Do you have company colors? Then create your PowerPoint using those company colors. If you are doing something about kindergarten kids, can you present it in colors and fonts that would appeal to kindergartners without violating the previous rules of making it clear, easy to read, simple, appropriate contrasting colors? If you're doing something about creating an elegant meal, is there a more elegant font or elegant design that is still follows the rules, easy to read, but helps convey the emotion of what it is that you're trying to get across? If you're going to use handouts, handouts should contain relevant information. What's relevant depends on what your topic is and what your speech goal is. Some possible things you could include in a handout. You could give additional details. If you had more information than could be provided in your speech, you could put that information on the handout. You could provide additional resources if you get your audience interested in whatever you're talking about. Maybe you're trying to get them involved in a political position. Maybe you want to give them the contact information to reach out to their congressmen or their senators. Sources for further research. Maybe you get them really interested and they want to do a little more research on their own. You could provide some sources for that. Perhaps you want to include instructions. If you're trying to teach someone something, you might provide instructions for them to take home to help them if they try to do it on their own. You might provide a brief summary of the information that you gave them. Depending on what you're presenting on, it might be helpful for your audience to take notes. You could create a place for that in your handout. And finally, you can use your handout to provide the references for your speech information. Some more information about designing your handouts. Be sure to provide a lot of white space. Don't crowd your handout with so much information that it feels overwhelming or is difficult to read. You want to make your handout look professional. Make sure it's the normal size, make sure it's designed well, you've spell checked it, it looks good. The handout is part of your speech and you want it to convey the kind of impression about you that you want to convey to your audience. You want to consider your additional resources. You might even want to think about creating a web page. You have to think about when you're going to distribute the handout, and you want to tell people if you're going to be providing a handout with whether information you're talking about is or is not in the handout. Yes, this is in the handout, this is not in the handout. You want to give them that information so they know what to write down, what they know they're going to have for later. You want to be sure you prepare those handouts in plenty of time. The handout is a different document. Don't just print out your slides and say, here's your handout. Yet you can communicate the same information that's on your slide if you're trying to present a summary for them, but you need to redesign the layout and some of the writing so that it's appropriate for a handout. Make sure the handout reflects your presentation. If you've used some design in the PowerPoint, certain colors, certain fonts, be consistent and use that same design in your handout. Make sure the handout is providing additional information. You might want to think about creating an action sheet, particularly if your speech goal is to have the audience do something after the speech is over. Creating an action sheet with a list of here's what you can do, maybe even with some checkout boxes, can be a valuable tool to get the audience to do what you want. And make sure your handout is standalone. Make sure that you've included enough information that if someone got the handout who was not at the speech, they could follow along, they could understand the information and accomplish whatever it is you were trying to accomplish with the handout. So in summary with handouts, make sure it's clear, easy to understand, that it's easy to read, and that it's attractive. Think about graphics, fonts, colored paper, etc. The handout shouldn't be an afterthought. It should be a designed part of your speech. Ultimately, you need to know the point of the handout and design it accordingly. So, you now have decided to use a visual aid. You've decided what it is. You've designed it well. How do you incorporate that into your speech event? Some basics. Be sure you know how to turn off and on all of the equipment before your speech starts. You don't want to be up there in front of the crowd fumbling with the machine trying to get things started. Be sure you know the basics of how to operate the equipment, how to adjust volume or focus or upload a computer program to get it started. Again, you don't want to be learning this in front of the audience. If at all possible, try to queue up your material before the presentation so that you're not up there trying to, say, pull up your PowerPoint once you've gone up to give the speech. If it's all possible, come early to make sure the equipment is working. And this is the important part. Always, always, always have a plan for what you're going to do if the equipment doesn't work. If you're using presentation software, do not lecture to your presentation software. One of the biggest mistakes is people who stand sideways or with their back to the audience and basically present to the screen. Your audience looks at the screen, you look at your audience. Be sure you practice using the handout or the software, whatever presentation aid you've decided, before you're giving the speech. So some of your rehearsals for your speech should include using the handouts. Some of the early ones may be just remembering your basic speech content, but out of your 10 rehearsals, I would say 4 to 5 should involve using your presentation aids. When you're not using them, so you may have a speech where you use a presentation aid throughout the whole speech, or you may have something where you're only using it for part of. Cover up or turn off the presentation aids when you're not using them. Otherwise, they become a distraction to the audience, which is not your goal. Depending on what you're using, you may want an assistant to help you handle your visual aids. So you can ask someone to flip your charts, to play your tapes, to move your slides forward. That way you can concentrate on your audience. Sometimes the physical layout of the space makes this absolutely necessary. Other times you could do it yourself, but it will be more helpful for an assistant to do it. If you can bring someone, great. If not, you may be able to ask someone in the audience to do it for you, depending on who your audience is. If you're using a handout, you need to ask yourself ahead of time, when are you going to give the handout? How are you going to give it? Do you want to give the handout at the beginning? If you give it at the beginning, the audience is going to be reading it. Do you want them to do that? Sometimes you do. Maybe you want them to take notes. Maybe you want them to follow along. Other times you don't want that. The handout will distract them. You want to give it out at the end. Whenever you give it out, they're going to stop listening to you and start reading the handout. So be prepared for that. And then think about, how are you going to do it? Are you going to hand it out? That's going to take time from your speech. Can you have an assistant hand it out? Sometimes you're going to have it sitting on the chair, so when people come in, the handout is right there. Maybe you give it to people as they exit the room because you just want them to take it with them. You need to decide ahead of time how you're going to do that. That's about it. Good luck. You now have some good information to design and use great handouts which will help you achieve your speech goal. I know you got this.